For the past year, the darkness has been at the forefront of Destiny 2, both in the narrative, but even more so in the gameplay. The darkness and its potential to introduce game-breaking new powers and subclasses is something that the community has lusted for ever since the earliest days of Destiny 1. Last year, Bungie launched Beyond Light and finally introduced the first ever darkness element, Stasis, into the game, and this was followed up by Luke Smith himself stating that Stasis will be the first of the darkness subclasses. So that begs the question, what will the next darkness element be that gets added to the game in the Witch Queen? As it stands, there are a ton of in-game and lore hints as to what this next darkness element will be. In Beyond Light, the player was granted the power of Stasis to beat the fallen empire massing on Europa at their own game. I firmly believe that in the Witch Queen, the player will be granted the power of Corruption, the source of the Hive's magic, in order to beat back Savathun's brood by using their darkness powers against them. I find this especially likely since the darkness has branded Savathun as a heretic and marked her for death for interfering with our communications with the pyramids in Season of Arrivals. For further evidence of Corruption being the next darkness element, consider the gameplay synergy of Thorn and the exotic gauntlet's necrotic grip, a phenomenon the likes of which Destiny has never really seen before. It almost feels like an early beta test for what Corruption as a fully fledged darkness element could be. I mean, the game even says that you died to Corruption when falling to necrotic grip inside the Crucible. And finally, there is strong evidence that points to Corruption as the next darkness element when analyzing the elements that are in the game today. Stasis is a dark mirror of Solar, with both elements manipulating systems thermodynamically, with Solar increasing entropy and Stasis decreasing entropy. Corruption is set to be the dark mirror of Arc, as Arc is about discharging electrons at our enemies via an electrical arc, whereas Corruption is about forcing matter to undergo radioactive decay and release energy in the form of positrons, energy that can then be harvested by an outside party, such as the Hive or Dark Guardians. In this video, I'm going to explain how I would design the next set of darkness subclasses coming to the game in the Witch Queen. We're going to discuss how Corruption as a unique element would function, and we will then discuss how Hunter, Titan, and Warlock Corruption subclasses would be designed with customizable aspects and fragments. Let's jump in. So, let's jump right in and discuss the design of Corruption as an element, both on a narrative level as well as on a gameplay level. On a narrative level, what exactly would Corruption be? What would it represent? As I mentioned during the intro, Corruption would act as a dark mirror to the light-based Arc element. Essentially, Arc energy excites electrons so much that it exceeds the binding energy of an atom, which causes said atom to become ionized. This is the basis for electricity and is also the process that binds molecules together and leads to the creation of complex matter like cells and DNA. In-game, we take this to the extreme, supercharging ourselves with arc energy and then channeling that chaos at our enemies through an electrical arc. Corruption, on the other hand, is a force of darkness that has the power to deconstruct the bonds of matter and tend towards simplicity rather than complexity, the way of the sword logic. In nature, this can be observed as a form of nuclear transmutation that occurs from radioactive decay, in which an electrically neutral atom will transmute into a simpler element of a lower atomic number, causing the atom to release energy in the form of a positron and a neutrino. Corruption is likely to be the force behind the Hive's magic, which can be boiled down to the Hive stripping living beings of their light and life force by forcing them to undergo radioactive decay through paracasual means. This extracted energy manifests itself as Hive Soulfire, which is used to feed their worms, power their weaponry or fuel their own growth. And there's a smoking gun backing up this entire explanation of how corruption and the Hive's magic works. The primary component of all known life on Earth is carbon. In humans, almost 99% of the carbon in our bodies is composed of the stable isotope carbon-12. Want to know what happens when you force carbon-12 to undergo radioactive decay? The carbon transmutes into an unstable isotope called boron-12. If the decay energy released is high enough during this process, it will cause an exothermic reaction of the boron molecules. And what does boron look like when it burns? Green fire. If you want to read more into this theory about the conceptual foundations for corruption, check out Lettuce Difference post on Destiny lore, which I've provided a link to down in the description. With the narrative background established for corruption, let's now discuss corruption on a gameplay level. I think that each element in the game should have a trio of unique effects similar to the slow, freeze, and shatter paradigm that Stasis is based around. For corruption, I think that this elemental trio should consist of corrode, decay, and transmute. My goal with these elemental effects is to place corruption on the same power level of Stasis in PvE, allow for meaningful customization choices, and to not ruin the game in PvP like Stasis has been doing since Beyond Light's launch. First up, let's discuss the corrode debuff. The corrode debuff would come in stacks, similar to the stacking system incorporated by Stasis Slow. When a target reaches 100 stacks of corrode, they would begin to decay. PvE combatants affected by corrode would have their health start draining, and all nearby combatants would suffer health drain as well. To keep things from getting out of hand in the Crucible, players affected by corrode would instead have their grenade, melee, and class ability energy start draining, and all nearby players would suffer ability energy drain as well. Targets afflicted with corrode would have a yellowish glow, similar to the glow effect caused by Thorn's Mark of the Devourer perk today. Corrode would last for 3 seconds by default, similar to the base duration of Stasis Slow. The inspiration for corrode comes from galvanic corrosion, an electrochemical process in which one metal corrodes when it's in electrical contact with another in the presence of an electrolyte. Basically, a target corroding in-game is beginning to lose their light to corrupting darkness, a process that then cascades when the afflicted player begins stripping the light of any other beings unlucky enough to be near them. Next up, let's talk about the decay debuff. The decay debuff would cause a target to suffer large ticks of damage over time while the decay debuff is active. Targets afflicted with decay would have a greenish glow, similar to the glow effect caused by Thorn's Mark of the Devourer. When a decaying target is defeated, it would leave behind a soulfire remnant that can be picked up by you and your allies. The decay debuff would last for 2 seconds against players and for 5 seconds against PvE combatants. In many ways, the decay debuff would be an amped up subclass version of how Thorn's Mark of the Devourer and Soul Remnant mechanics work in game today. On a thematic level, decay is effectively the final form of corrode, and a decaying target is one that has been completely corrupted by the darkness, to the point that they are leaking large amounts of their light, hence the large chunks of damage over time. A decaying target is also weakened enough to be fully transmuted into mere energy in the form of soulfire remnants, energy that can be harvested by the darkness user that had exposed them to corruption in the first place. And lastly, let's talk about the transmute effect. The transmute effect would be triggered either by picking up a soulfire remnant or by some corruption abilities directly. The transmute effect is unique from the final elemental property of Stasis in that it is not an AoE effect that damages nearby targets. Triggering the transmute effect would grant a small amount of health and provide continuous health restoration while Transmute is active. Think of this as the player transmuting the life force of enemy targets, rending them down to mere energy to be consumed. The Transmute effect would have a 3-second duration by default. Now that I've explained the premise of Corruption on both a narrative and gameplay level, let's dive in to discuss how I would design the Tormentor, a Corruption-themed hunter subclass. With the elemental properties of Corruption explained, we can now discuss how Hunter, Titan, and Warlock Corruption subclasses can be designed with customizable aspects and fragments. We're going to start this discussion with Corruption Hunters, which I have dubbed Tormentors. When I set about designing the Tormentor, I first took a look at the other supers that Hunters have in the game today. Hunters have multiple one-and-done super abilities like Tether, Blade Barrage, Silence and Squall, and Celestial Nighthawk Golden Gun. As for close-quarter roaming supers, Hunters really only have Arc Strider and Spectral Blades. I think that Hunters are in need of a powerful new roaming super ability, a conclusion that drove the design of the new super ability for the Tormentor, Chains of Corruption. This super lets the player conjure a pair of corrosive chains to whip and lash their foes into submission, with the ability to perform quick whip attacks or a great spin attack to hit all nearby enemies with a large AoE effect. The Chains of Corruption were inspired from a few different sources, with the visuals being reminiscent of chained up hive ogres like Fogoth from the Summoning Pits, and the gameplay being inspired by the final boss of Majora's Mask, a monster with chains for arms that roams the battlefield and attempts to whip and lash the player to death. In addition to the super ability, you'd have your usual choice of dodge as well as your jump. As for the melee, Tormentors would have an ability called Corroding Lash, which would allow the player to lash out at their foes with an overhead chain whip attack, an attack that would cause all impacted targets to corrode. Think of how Trevor Belmont from Castlevania uses his whip to smite his foes with overhead attacks. Tormentors would specialize in corroding their foes, with Corruption Titans being specialists of decay and Corruption Warlocks being specialists of transmutation. When it comes to grenades, there would be 3 different options shared across Corruption Hunters, Titans, and Warlocks, similar to how Duskfield, Cold Snap, and Glacier grenades are shared across the 3 Stasis subclasses. The first grenade option would be the Plague Grenade, which would burst on impact and leave behind a cloud of gas that corrodes targets and decays those that stay in the gas cloud too long. This grenade would be very similar to the balls of disorienting smoke used by Hive Wizards. The second grenade option would be the Sundering Blast Grenade, an explosive grenade that causes targets to decay and take damage over time. This grenade would be very similar to incendiary grenades, but with more of the damage being applied through DOT instead of the initial explosion. The third and final grenade option would be the Transmutation Grenade, which would conjure a transmutation circle upon impacting a surface and then transmute the life force of any targets within the circle's radius. This grenade would behave in a similar fashion to the Purple Hive runes conjured by the boss of the Broodhold Strike, which spawn on the floor and then quickly damage anyone that stands in the circle for too long. This grenade would also act as a trap and not go off until a target enters the circle's radius, making it an effective zone control tool, similar in function to the Hive traps used heavily in the Rise of Iron expansion. For the aspects, I've designed an initial 2 per class, similar to Stasis at the launch of Beyond Light. The first Tormentor aspect would be Grappling Chain, an air move that allows the player to thrust one of their corrosive chains into a surface and pull themselves to it. This would be very similar to the grappling hook used in the upcoming game Halo Infinite, albeit with more momentum to keep up with the faster pace of Destiny 2. This ability would have a small cooldown, similar to Icarus Dash. However, while the Chains of Corruption super is active, this cooldown would be removed. allowing the player to pull themselves from surface to surface like a darkness-infused Spider-Man. The second Tormentor aspect would be Galvanic Accelerator, where defeating a corroding target causes it to emit a non-damaging blast of corrosive energy that causes all impacted targets to begin corroding themselves. This would function a lot like Necrotic Grip, which causes poisoned targets to emit a wave of corrupting energy when they die. This aspect would have a small cooldown, as it would be possible to start infinite chain reactions of corroding mobs, an ability a tad too strong for normal gameplay. However, like the grappling chain, this cooldown would be removed while the Chains of Corruption super is active, giving the super incredible ad-clearing potential by causing constant blasts of corrosive energy with each and every kill. And now, let's discuss the Corruption Fragments. I've designed an initial 8 fragments that can be used by Corruption Hunters, Titans, and Warlocks, similar to how the Stasis fragments are ubiquitous across the 3 Stasis subclasses. The first of these fragments would be Whisper of Evolution, where picking up Soulfire Remnants would temporarily boost your grenade recharge rate, and picking up additional Soulfire Remnants would increase the duration of this benefit. This fragment would be the corruption equivalent of the Stasis fragment Whisper of Shards. Next up would be Whisper of Unmaking, where the damage over time caused by decay would be increased against combatants. This fragment would be the corruption equivalent of the Stasis fragment Whisper of Fissures, but with the caveat that it is PvE only, as damage over time is already an extremely potent ability in the Crucible, and I don't want corruption DOT inside the Crucible to get anywhere near the power levels of pre-nerf Thorn or Viking Funeral from Destiny 1. No, thank you. The third corruption fragment would be Whisper of the Plague, and it would make corrode from your abilities last longer, increase the duration of abilities that linger, and would grant a bonus plus 10 mobility. This fragment would be the corruption version of the Stasis fragment Whisper of Durance. The fourth corruption fragment would be Whisper of the Devourer, which would grant nearby allies increased recovery speed and a faster class ability cooldown while the transmute effect is active, and would grant a bonus plus 10 recovery. This fragment would be the corruption subclass version of the exotic perk Insatiable found on Apotheosis Veil. The fifth corruption fragment would be Whisper of Sorrow, which would grant a bonus to weapon damage after defeating corroding or decaying targets, and it would incur a penalty of minus 10 discipline. This fragment would be the corruption equivalent to the Stasis fragment Whisper of Hedrons before it was nerfed, but would grant a smaller damage bonus of 15% instead of the 25% buff that Hedrons used to give. The sixth corruption fragment would be Whisper of Screams, where defeating decaying targets grants you super energy, and it would incur penalties of minus 10 intellect and minus 10 strength. This fragment would be the corruption equivalent of the Stasis fragment Whisper of Bonds. The seventh corruption fragment would be Whisper of Soulfire, which would cause Soulfire remnants to track to your position. It would grant bonuses of plus 10 discipline and plus 10 strength. This fragment would be the corruption equivalent to the Stasis fragment Whisper of Conduction. And finally, the eighth corruption fragment would be Whisper of Suffering, which would grant melee energy each time you take damage from targets. This fragment would be the corruption equivalent of the Stasis fragment Whisper of Torment. And with all these new abilities, Tormentor Hunters would have the freedom of customization that the Aspect and Fragment system allows, while also being able to completely spec into the corrosive sub-identity of Corruption. Combine the Chains of Corruption and Corroding Lash that each inflict corrosive damage with every hit, with a plague grenade that corrodes all enemies trapped within, which all synergize perfectly with an aspect like Galvanic Accelerator that amplifies the amount of corrosive energy permeating the battlefield. This corrosive specialty can then be boosted with fragments like Whisper of the Plague to extend the duration of corrosive attacks, as well as Whisper of Sorrow to get a boost to weapon damage each time you take down corroding foes. And you can take this even further with the fragment Whisper of Suffering to get your Corroding Lash melee ability back even faster. This crazy corrosive build is just one example of what would be possible as a Corruption Hunter. Now, let's turn our eyes to the design of the Lancer, a Corruption-themed Titan subclass. Now, let's take a deep dive into the subclass for a Corruption Titan, which I have dubbed a Lancer. When I set about designing the Lancer, I once again took a look at the other supers that Titans have in the game today. Titans have a huge amount of roaming supers, with Fist of Havoc, Hammer of Soul, Glacial Quake, and Sentinel Shield. On the other hand, Titans only have 2 one-and-done super abilities, those being Thunder Crash and Ward of Dawn. Titans have 0 ranged one-and-done supers, whereas Hunters have 3 and Warlocks have 2. This clear need of a ranged one-and-done super is what drove the design of the new super ability for the Lancer, Sorrow's Lance. This super lets the player summon a powerful lance infused with corruption and throw it at their foes, causing a blast of decaying energy that deals massive damage and leaves a damage-dealing field in its wake. Sorrow's Lance was inspired by a few different sources, most notably the Valkyries provided by Rasputin that were introduced back in Warmind. Unlike those smaller javelins that could be charged up and thrown multiple times, Sorrow's Lance is more akin to a single-use nuclear bomb, and would be an amped-up spiritual successor to the old D1 perk Lance that transformed Nova Bomb into a straight-line missile. In addition to the super ability, you'd have your usual choice of Barricade, as well as your Lift. As for the melee, Lancers would have an ability called Decayed Lance, which would allow the player to wind up and throw a lance at their enemies, an attack that would cause all afflicted targets to decay, with precision hits causing the lance to deal extra damage. The wind-up mechanic would be similar in function to the knife twirl that is performed before throwing weighted knife of Bottom Tree Golden Gun, and a precision hit would be a one-hit kill inside PvP. Lancers would specialize in decaying their foes, a role analogous to the corroding specialties of Tormentor Hunters. When it comes to grenades, Corruption Titans would have the same 3 options that were available to the Corruption Hunter: Sundering Blast Grenades, Plague Grenades, and Transmutation Grenades. For the aspects, I've again designed an initial 2 per class. The first Lancer aspect would be Lancer's Charge, which would allow the player to hold down their class ability button to replace their barricade with a surge of corrupting energy, which would boost their movement speed and lift momentum for a short time. Additionally, when activating Lancer's Charge, the player would create a burst around themselves that decays targets. Lancer's Charge would operate almost exactly like the Titan Exotic Gauntlet's Icefall Mantle, but instead of making you a slow-moving tank, you instead become a speed demon. And this ability would allow Titans to build up momentum with successive jumps and Titan skate once more. The second Lancer aspect would be Roar of the Worm, which would let the decayed lance stick to surfaces and targets and then linger for a short time, periodically sending out bursts of energy that cause targets to decay. This aspect would effectively turn the decayed lance melee ability into a second grenade ability, as you'd be able to throw your lance into groups of enemies or near spawn points for zone control and quickly cause tons of enemies to decay. As for fragments, Lancer Titans would then be able to choose from the same 8 corruption fragments that we discussed earlier in the video, giving them customization flexibility while also letting them fully spec into the decay sub-identity of corruption. Combine the decayed lance with the Roar of the Worm aspect to have the ultimate poison-tipped spear, and then throw in the Sundering Blast Grenade to bring yet another destructive decay ability to the battlefield. This decaying specialty can then be boosted with fragments like Whisper of Unmaking to increase the damage dealt over time from decay against PvE combatants. And why stop there? Throw on Whisper of Sorrow to get a boost to weapon damage each time you defeat a decaying target, and you can also rock Whisper of Screams to get large chunks of super energy back each time you kill a decaying target, which means that you get to chuck the nuclear weapon known as Sorrow's Lance even more often. This awesome decay build is just one example of what you'd be able to do as a Corruption Titan. Now, let's turn our eyes to the design of the Alchemage, a Corruption-themed Warlock subclass. Now, let's take a deep dive into the subclass for a Corruption Warlock, which I have dubbed an Alchemage. When I set about designing the Alchemage, I once again took a look at the other supers that Warlocks have in the game today. Warlocks are pretty balanced when it comes to the roaming super versus one-and-done super debate. Warlocks have a number of roaming supers such as Nova Warp, Dawnblade, Stormcaller, and Winter's Wrath. When it comes to one-and-done supers, Warlocks also have plenty of great options, such as Chaos Reach, Nova Bomb, and Well of Radiance. Without a clear need one way or the other, I decided to really lean into the Mad Alchemist identity for the Corruption Warlock, which fits perfectly with the third and final sub-identity of Corruption, that being Transmutation. The new super ability for the Alchemage is Heart of Soulfire, in which the player enters an alchemic trance to transmute their foes and corrupt their surroundings. With one hand, the player would be able to shoot blasts of soulfire at their foes, and with their other hand, they would be able to position a transmutation circle on a surface and then release to transmute all targets within. The Heart of Soulfire super was inspired by a ton of different sources, with the Hive Soulfire blasts being very similar to the fireball attacks used by Nokris in the old Strange Terrain Strike, and the Transmutation Circle attack being an amped up version of the Transmutation Grenade. But with the twist, the player can charge up the Transmutation Circle and place it instantly and completely accurately on any surface they like, with the aiming mechanic being similar to using Salvation's Grip, which shows a blue light in the exact spot on a surface that the projectile will land. In addition to the super ability, you'd again have your usual choice of Rift, as well as your jump. As for the melee, Alchemages would have an ability called Philosopher's Grasp, which would allow the player to hold their melee input to charge an alchemic rune and take aim at their target, and then releasing the melee input to damage them and transmute their life force. The aiming mechanic for Philosopher's Grasp would once again function in a similar fashion to Salvation's Grip, but it would have a limited range to keep it in a balanced state. Usually, Warlocks have the ability to charge up and hold a grenade, like Handheld Supernova or Chaos Accelerant. Now, imagine charging up a melee and then releasing it to perform a ranged lifesteal ability, turning Alchemage Warlocks into bona fide vampires. Alchemages would specialize in transmuting their foes, similar to how Hunters corrode and Titans decay. When it comes to grenades, Corruption Warlocks would again have the same three options that were available to the Corruption Hunter and Titan: Transmutation Grenades, Plague Grenades, and Sundering Blast Grenades. For the aspects, I've once again designed an initial 2 per class. The first Alchemage aspect would be Alchemic Haste, where casting your Rift would generate a shockwave that transmutes the life force of any targets caught in the blast. Additionally, passing through the Rift would boost movement speed and weapon handling for you and your allies for a short time. Alchemic Haste would be the Corruption version of the Stasis aspect Frost Pulse, but would provide additional utility beyond just being an elemental shockwave when you cast your Rift. The speed boost granted from passing through an Alchemic Haste Rift would be a cool way to transform the usually slow, defensive playstyle encouraged by Rifts into an ability that instead allows you to take the offensive and help your entire team rush your enemies with enhanced movement and weapon handling speeds. The second Alchemage aspect would be Rune of Power, causing abilities to do more damage, regenerate faster, and weapon reload speed to increase for a short time after triggering the transmute effect. This aspect would allow the Alchemage, a master of transmutation and the dark alchemy of corruption, to reap even more benefits than just the base health restoration granted by the transmute effect. As for fragments, Alchemage Warlocks would then be able to choose from the same 8 corruption fragments that we discussed earlier in the video, giving them customization flexibility while also letting them fully spec into the transmutation sub-identity of corruption. Combine the transmuting powers of Philosopher's Grasp, the Transmutation Grenade, and the Heart of Soulfire Super with the Rune of Power aspect to become the Darkness's ultimate mad scientist. And why stop there? Throw on the Fragment Whisper of the Devourer to give your teammates a boost while you're busy transmuting and devouring your foes. Say your teammates are running decay-focused corruption builds and generating lots of Soulfire remnants. You could then throw on the Fragment Whisper of Evolution to boost your grenade recharge rate when picking up Soulfire remnants, which in turn triggers the transmute effect. This gameplay loop can be made even more seamless with the Fragment Whisper of Soulfire to automatically draw Soulfire remnants towards you. This insane transmutation build is just one example of the awesome power you'd hold as a corruption warlock. And just like that, we've come to the end of another video. Hopefully you guys all enjoyed this latest installment and how we can continue to evolve Destiny 2. I didn't work alone on this project, and it was the insanely talented Paint This Ice that created all the character artwork and subclass menu UI symbols that you saw throughout the video. I had a cool vision in my head for what corruption could mean and how it could be designed to fit within Destiny's sandbox, but Paint did the impossible and made these crazy ideas of mine into something real. Artwork so good that if you slap the Bungie ArtStation markings on it, I'd think that these were the real deal. With August 24th and the Witch Queen reveal stream fast approaching, I am beyond excited to see what kind of new darkness powers and subclasses await us in the next big DLC. And who knows, maybe these concepts of mine aren't so far-fetched, and maybe we'll see some echoes of these designs appear in the game one day, be it Witch Queen or beyond. If you guys want to see more of this kind of content, make sure to subscribe, hit that like button, and leave a comment down below. The YouTube algorithm loves comments more than anything, so leaving even a few words will help this video succeed more than you know. Have an amazing week, guys, and I hope to catch you all in the next one. This has been your host, Kujay. Cheers.